Before I cover their game against the Colts, where things would go from bad to worse, I'm going to do a mini spotlight now on Vince Lombardi's assistant coaches, starting with Phil Bingston, the defensive coordinator, and only assistant to stay with him for the entirety of his tenure with the Packers. Bingston would begin his life in football in his home state, where he played tackle at the University of Minnesota, earning All American honors in 1934. From 1951 to 1958, he was a defensive assistant with the San Francisco 49ers, where he got the attention of Vince Lombardi. If you look at the raw numbers for that 1958 49ers team, it might come across as a little surprising that Bingston would get picked up by Lombardi. Their ability to stop the run was among the worst, with opposing teams averaging 5.4 yards per carry against them, ranking 10th in the league that had just 12 teams. However, against the pass, things got much better as there were only 2 clubs that surrendered fewer yards. So even though Bingston started his career working with the line, it was perhaps his pass defense that got Lombardi's attention. And it was under his leadership that the Packers defense would give up the 3rd fewest yards in 1959. Bingston's demeanor contrasted with Lombardi, but one could argue that this helped the situation as it gave players an emotional break from their head coach's intensity. Backfield coach Red Cochran played college ball at Wake Forest, where he was named to the All-Southern Conference team in 1942. However, World War II interrupted his career, where he signed up and served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Forces. After his service was up, he finished his education and got his professional start as a rookie cornerback for the 1947 NFL champion Chicago Cardinals. However, his time as a player would be cut short as he would be out of the league after his 4th season in 1950. He would return to Wake Forest as an assistant from 1951 to 1955 before moving on to the Detroit Lions from 1956 to 1958 as a quarterback and running back coach. He, however, was let go after the 1958 season, and it's there in 1959 that he met Lombardi. Years later, Cochran would be interviewed about his earlier experiences. Below are some of the excerpts from these interviews conducted by the staff of the Green Bay Packers official website and posted by Cliff Crystal. I was fired in Detroit and I talked to Red Hickey about joining his staff in San Francisco. But a sports writer in Detroit, I can't remember his name, had met me in a golf outing and he said he had gone to school with Lombardi. I called him and informed him Lombardi had been hired in Green Bay. The writer told me he had called Lombardi to congratulate him on getting the Green Bay job and mentioned that I was available. So he said, "Be alert for a phone call." Sure as hell, about an hour later, Vince called me. He was on his way from New York to Green Bay, but had to change planes in Detroit. He asked me if I could meet him at the airport to interview me. I interviewed for the job at the airport between planes. This was on a Tuesday, and he said, "Don't do anything until you hear from me, but if you have other interviews, go ahead." He called me back on Friday and said, "Are you still interested in coming to Green Bay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "When can you be here?" I said, "Monday." He also talked about some of the early meetings. Once we got here as a staff, we started having meetings, and it was just like being a player. He was on the blackboard explaining things and doing the same things he'd do in front of a group of players in a room. It was a question of him teaching us what he wanted us to teach the players. It was with the Green Bay Packers that Red Cochran would continue his duties with the backfield. Under his and Lombardi's watch, they would capture the NFL rushing crown 3 times. Offensive line coach Bill Austin played tackle at Oregon State College, where he was named All-Coast in 1948. In 1949, he was drafted by the New York Giants. He missed the 1951 and 1952 seasons due to military service before returning to the Giants. It was in that following year that he met Vince Lombardi, who was a new offensive coordinator. With Lombardi, Austin won the 1956 NFL championship game, and he retired after the 1957 season. And once again, the Green Bay Packers official site has a few published interviews, this time with Austin, where I'll highlight the ones pertinent for 1959. I had a pretty good relationship with Lombardi when he was coaching in New York. I was a small guy for a guard, maybe 218 pounds, and always went full speed, and he liked people like that. Evidently, he thought I had the ability to teach. This is evidenced by the fact that it was Lombardi who reached out to Austin for the assistant coaching job. Austin continues, I wanted to be a coach after playing for 7 years. While I was playing in New York, Jim Lee Howe was our tight end coach. We'd practice in the morning, and Jim Lee Howe was the head coach of Wagner College. We drove over, got on the ferry, and got over to Staten Island, and I was his line coach. This is an interesting detail, as the idea of Jim Lee Howe being an assistant coach in the NFL while being the head coach of a college team at the same time is a bit odd. I was actually aware of this fact based on a previous newspaper article I'd seen, although I do not know how common it was back then or even the last time such a thing happened. But it's an interesting reminder of how much the game has changed. Anyway, back to Bill Austin and his first foray into coaching. I enjoyed it and coached at the University of Wichita as line coach in 1958, then went with Vince to Green Bay. Austin would coach the line for the Packers from 1959 to 1964. After being the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers from 1966 to 1968, he followed Lombardi to the Washington Redskins, where he again would be his line coach for Lombardi's final coaching season. Defensive backs coach Norm Hecker won small college All-American honors in 1950, and this led to him being drafted by the Los Angeles Rams the following year. He would have a key tackle in the 1951 NFL Championship game, where he and the Rams would capture the title. After the 1953 season, he decided to play for the Canadian Football League before coming back to the NFL in 1955 with the Redskins. In 1958, he would have one final stint in the CFL with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. He would finish his NFL career with 28 interceptions. Once again, we have more interview excerpts from the Green Bay Packers site, again posted by Cliff Crystal. Here, he discussed how he got the position with Green Bay. Jack Venisi called me and said Lombardi wanted to talk to me about coming to Green Bay. I didn't know Vince from Adam. I went to Green Bay and talked to Lombardi, but spent more time with Phil Bingston. Lombardi told me he was going to Jack Mara's funeral in New York and that he would call me the next week. Lombardi called me the next day and told me I was hired. I heard later that Buddy Parker had recommended me. And here he discusses his relationship with Bingston. He ran the defense, and Lombardi would only occasionally stop in meetings to make a recommendation. Bingston coached a long time, and he knew the teams in the league very well. Teams were pretty basic in those days. Defenses were basic. There wasn't a lot of blitzing. There wasn't a lot of sophisticated defenses. Now on to receivers coach Tom Fears. He is something of an interesting case, as even though he had a prolific playing career with the Rams and he was the very first coach of the New Orleans Saints, there's very little information on his time coaching the ends for the Packers. This would be more understandable if he was only there for 1 year. However, he had 2 stints with the team. The first was in 1959, and then he returned from 1962 to 1965, so Fears won 2 championships with Lombardi. However, Pro Football Reference does not mention his time there, and if you go to Google and type in these search terms, you will find no articles that directly showcase him. Stories that involve him and Lombardi can be located, but this is a time in his life that seems largely glossed over, despite the fact that it comprises a total of 5 whole years. Fears has an interesting background, as his father, Charles Fears, was an American mining engineer, and it was there in Guadalajara that Fears was initially brought up until he moved to Los Angeles when he was 6. After his high school graduation, he went to Santa Clara University before being caught up in World War II. Once out of the military, he went to UCLA in 1945, and after he graduated, he was picked up by the Los Angeles Rams in 1948, where from 48 to 1956, he proceeded to rack up a career total of 400 receptions. In 1959, the Packers hired him to coach the ends, which included Max McGee and a young Boy Dialer. In terms of Lombardi's coaching tree, it's a bit underwhelming as none of his assistant coaches won any championships or even got to championship games when they became head coaches on their own. So, what gives? Well, Bill Austin would become the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1966, and he didn't have a lot to work with. This squad was far removed from the future Steelers dynasty teams of the 1970s, as they didn't yet have Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris, Len Swan, John Stallworth, Jack Ham, or Joe Green. Instead, this was a squad with a horrendous 2.9 yards per rush, and this was extra embarrassing as Austin started off as an offensive line coach. And on that 1966 team, only 3 players would make the Pro Bowl. Right cornerback Brady Keys, right defensive end Ben McGee, and kicker Mike Clark. And in 1970, Austin took the reins of the Washington Redskins from Lombardi. He took a team that had a winning record and proceeded to produce a loser that went 6-8. In that season, Washington had plenty of talent in both the passing and running game. In fact, the team averaged 4.6 yards per rush. So it wasn't the offense that was the issue this time. Instead, it was the defense that was a culprit, where they ranked 24th in yards, and the league had 26 teams then. So Austin inherited a bad team in the Steelers that had a horrendous running game and no quarterback, and he wasn't able to build a team up through their trades or the draft. Then, he finally does get a good team that Lombardi built in 1969, only for the club to falter because they couldn't stop anybody on defense. Austin would finish his head coaching career with a combined record of 17 wins, 36 losses, 3 ties, and 0 winning seasons. Okay, let's go on to Norm Hecker, who became the very first coach of the Atlanta Falcons. Anytime someone gets a brand new franchise, it's normal to expect them to be bad for a few years, and they were. His team started off at 3-11 in 1966, then actually got worse with a 1-12-1 record in 1967, before finally getting fired after an 0-3 start in 1968. The highlight of his time with the Falcons was actually his first year, the one with 3 wins. Why were the Falcons still bad 3 seasons in? For one, they couldn't run the ball. In 1968, they racked up just 3.6 yards per carry, and their passing game was so terrible, the leading receiver for the season had 28 catches. That was a bad stat even for 1968. The offense finished dead last in the league. That's okay though, because they made up for it by having a terrible defense, which also finished last. At least Austin was able to say he had one team with a good offense with the Redskins. Hecker's 1968 team had just one Pro Bowler, middle linebacker Tommy Nobis. So Hecker got a new franchise, but he wasn't able to build them up. He finished with a coaching record of 4 victories and 26 losses and 1 tie, and like Austin, he had 0 winning seasons. Tom Fair, just like Hecker, got to become the first head coach of a brand new franchise, the New Orleans Saints. Well, the Saints get points for recognizing the diamond in the rough that was Billy Kilmer. He would have a bad start in the league with the 49ers, where he only started 1 single game in 4 years. He missed a 5th one with an injury. However, there was something to him that Tom Fears and the Saints saw. Unfortunately, this wouldn't come to fruition while he was with New Orleans. It wouldn't be until he ended up with the Washington Redskins that he showed he could really produce, but still, I give honorable mention for this. Now, let's look at the rest of the team. In 1969, Fair's 3rd year, the Saints had not one, but 2 Pro Bowl running backs in Andy Livingston and Tony Baker, and a star wide receiver in Danny Abramowitz. However, the defense finished 15th out of 16 teams. I say just 16 because this was right before the 1970 merger with the AFL. Fairs would finish his career with 13 wins, 34 losses, and 2 ties. Now on to Phil Bingston, who took over from Lombardi to coach the Packers in 1968. Well, the defense that year played well, giving up the third fewest yards in the league. In 10 of their 14 games, they held the opposing team to under 20 points, and Bart Starr played well, especially for 1968 standards. So, what was the issue? Well, just because a quarterback puts up good stats doesn't mean that always translates into actually winning games. The offense failed to produce at least 20 points in half of their matches. So this was an instance where the defense got things done, but ultimately the offense wasn't holding up its end of the bargain. So it was a problem opposite of the 1969 Saints. Bingston would coach the Packers from 1968 to 1970, and in 1972, he would briefly coach the Patriots to a 1-4 record. In his career, he would compile one winning season, the only winning season of any of Lombardi's assistants, and he would finish with a record of 21 wins, 25 losses, and 1 tie. So Norb Hacker never had a team with much talent. Austin only had real talent when he took over Lombardi's Redskins. Fears built a good offense, but couldn't get it done in defense. And Bingston had talent in 1968, once again for Lombardi, but it was aging talent that was going downhill. This helps to demonstrate the importance of Green Bay having a great scouting system led by Jack Vanisi. That being said, you could be a fine assistant coach, but a bad head coach. Sometimes people can be promoted one step above where their strengths are. Regardless of the reasons, it's interesting to see that multiple people were given a blueprint by Lombardi and none of them were able to replicate it. It just shows how much heavy lifting he was doing for the Packers. Now let's get back to the newspaper accounts so we can see the Packers take on the defending NFL champion Baltimore Colts. October 26. In Baltimore, in their first true road game of the season, the Packers lost to the Colts 38-21. So just how bad were things? Well, after the match, Colts quarterback Johnny Unitas said he played the best game in my career. And just how good was this game? Well, he completed 19 out of 29 passes for 206 yards with 3 touchdowns and no interceptions. This loss, like the last one against the Rams, was close at halftime with Baltimore only leading by 7 points. So let's examine what happened and see what went wrong. To deal with the Colts and their prolific air attack, the Packers moved Jesse Whittington from right cornerback to the left side to cover Colts receiver Lenny Moore, who ended up with no touchdown catches for the game, although he did have 4 catches for 41 yards. Veteran Bobby Dillon covered the right side when he went up against Raymond Berry. Well, early in the match, Dillon was hurt tackling Berry, and he never came back. The game started with Colts running back Alan Amici rushing 13 yards to take it to the Baltimore 35. Despite Unitas' overall great game, the Packers at first were able to keep him at bay. On his first attempt to pass, he fumbled after being hit by Bill Forrester and Nate Borden recovered the ball for the Packers. McCann then hit Knaffel for 25 yards to take it to the Packer 45. On third down, a penalty took the ball to the Colts 36. However, McCann then fumbled in a controversial call that could have been ruled an incomplete pass. Instead, Art Donovan and the Colts recovered the ball, killing that drive. The Colts then ran 6 times for 29 yards, but then Unitas fumbled. On the last play of the first, McCann then threw to McGee for 24 yards to take it to the Packers 45. In the second, Luke Carpenter broke through for a 55-yard touchdown run to give the Packers an early 7-0 lead. The Colts came back with an 8-yard touchdown pass to Raymond Berry from Unitas to tie it up. Then Alan Amici ran in from 3 yards to put the Colts ahead at the half 14-7. In the third, Max McGee and McCann then connected in an 81-yard bomb to tie the score at 14. And in the third, Tom Bettis would get a hit on Unitas. Bettis said, "He kicked me in the head after we went down. I could have really let him have it, but it would have been 15. He was wide open." Following the Colts returning a punt 30 yards to the Green Bay 36, Unitas threw a 3-yard touchdown pass to Amici to make it 21-14 in favor of Baltimore. Bill Pellington then intercepted a McCann pass and returned it 30 yards for a touchdown. Then McCann was picked off again, this time by Ray Brown, who took it 47 yards into the Packers' red zone. This was followed by a 2-yard pass from Unitas to Berry to make it 35-14. In the fourth quarter, Steve Myra booted a 43-yarder to extend the Colts' lead to 38-14. Then the Packers scored a cosmetic touchdown and a 4-yard pass from McCann to Boyd Dowler to make the final score 38-21. Lamar McCann would finish with these stats: 14 out of 27 for 233 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. Lou Carpenter would be the standout on the ground, although most of that would come in that 55-yard touchdown run. He would finish with these stats: 9 carries for 88 yards and a touchdown. The 2 standout receivers of this game would be Max McGee and Gary Knaffel, who would rack up these stats. Max McGee would get 3 catches for 110 yards and a touchdown, and Gary Knaffel would have 5 catches for 69 yards. After the game, Lombardi had high praise for Unitas. "He's the greatest I ever saw, he does everything well, and he had himself a great day today." And McCann, his own quarterback, Lombardi said, "He's going to be a great one for us someday. He's starting to take charge despite the fact that he's not entirely familiar with his team yet." Once again, this was a game that was close at the half, and it was only until the third period that Baltimore pulled away. This was a case of 2 teams perhaps being more evenly matched than it would first appear, but the Packers simply didn't have the stamina and patience to go the distance. October 27th. The paper reported that in their next game on the road, the Packers must beat Lombardi's former team, the 4-1 Giants. Green Bay at 3-2 trailed the 4-1 Colts and 49ers in the Western Division standings. Another loss might mean their season would be over. From a modern perspective, it's a bit bizarre to consider that if a club has a 3-3 record, they were probably finished, but it made sense at the time due to the limited number of games and the fact that normally only 1 playoff match was played per year unless a tiebreaker was necessary. So let's look at every NFL team from 1950 to 1958 that started off the season at 3-3 to see how they fared. As you can see, 24 clubs started off at 3-3, but only 2 made the postseason and only 1 of them won the championship. The other 22 teams, even if they finished with a winning record, had to stay home. Of course, this was still a rebuilding year, so the pressure wouldn't be on them quite as much, and there's 2 straight losses probably caused most fans' expectations to come back down to earth. However, Lombardi hated to lose, and even in a year where he didn't think he had a shot at a championship, it still must have bothered him. It was noted that Giants player Frank Gifford would be missing the upcoming game due to rib injuries. Lombardi said, "I feel bad about that. I wanted to play them at their best." October 28th. More previews are given for their next game against the Giants. In particular, they mentioned the fine passing play of New York quarterback Chuck Connerly, who is currently leading the league. 5 games into the season, Connerly had thrown for 855 yards and had completed 60.2% of his passes, which was called an amazing stat. On top of this, he had 4 touchdown passes and 3 interceptions with an average of 9.19 yards per attempt. Of these stats, the only one that would be considered great in 2023 would be his yards per attempt, which would be excellent in any time period. However, passing stats are a bit like money in that there's a type of inflation that happens to them over the decades, based not only on the speed and talent of the players, but also the rules becoming more and more favorable to the offense. When you consider that in 1959, defenders were allowed to harass receivers up and down the field, and you could hit a quarterback both high and low, and 0 flags would be thrown, it's no wonder the numbers were noticeably worse. So for that time period, a 60.2 completion percentage actually did stand out. Lombardi was asked about his former quarterback's performance and said, "Connerly has always been a high percentage passer, always over 50%. He's been throwing more this year and doing very well. He played just about all of the first 4 games, but Shaw worked the second half of the game last Sunday. And Jimmy Taylor was observed in practice. However, Lombardi said he probably wouldn't be ready for another couple games. And Giants coach Jim Lee Howe talked up Lombardi, his former assistant. I have all the admiration in the world for Vince. He works and studies hard. Nothing would give me more pleasure than for him to win the National Football League's Western Division, but... And then the paper cut off the rest of that quote, but noted that Howe talked about what he would like the Giants to do in the game. Maybe sports writer Art Daly's notes in that section weren't legible, or he simply didn't record that part, but it was the typical diplomatic line about wishing a team well, except when they play against you. October 29th. As the Packers were about to fly off to New York to face the Giants, a send-off was encouraged. It was noted after the Colts game, a couple hundred fans greeted the team at Austin's Dribble Field despite their loss and despite the plane being half an hour early. October 30th. The Packers are listed as 7-point underdogs to the Giants. Lombardi, not surprisingly, seemed to be treating the match against his former team as just another game. The paper mentioned Lombardi having a big backing in the New York area due not only to him being a former Giants assistant coach and an assistant at West Point, but also because of his Brooklyn roots. October 31st. The Giants, the defending Eastern Division champions, were going to be a tough one for Lombardi's Packers. Art Daly himself thought that maybe quarterback McCann or safety Emlyn Tunnell, the former Giant, might make the difference in the game. Tunnell spoke about his own experience in facing McCann back when he was with New York. He's tough on the Giants. I know that from experience. He beat us once 37-7, and it was a good beating. Tunnell then gave his own thoughts on facing New York. Yes, I know what they have, and I figure they'll run a lot on us. I'll sure keep my eyes open. The Giants' run defense was highlighted, stating that the Packers would have a tough time against them. However, Green Bay was still expected to run a lot. Former Green Bay Packers runner Johnny Blood made a surprise appearance at practice. The future Hall of Famer, who would be inducted in 1963 as a charter member, was a key component of the Packers from 1929 to 1933. He was visiting relatives out east and said, "I just had to see the big game." And Jerry Kramer had an embarrassing experience. He had driven to the airport with his wife, who had dropped him off. While the plane was waiting to depart, Captain Bud Smith made an announcement. Mr. Jerry Kramer has the keys to the family car in his pocket, and his wife can't get home. So they had to take the plane back to the terminal, where the captain then threw the keys out the cockpit window so they could be collected by the airport crew below and be given back to Kramer's wife. This was a chartered flight, not a regular commercial one, so imagine the standards for what you could get away with would be different even now, although opening the cockpit window to throw the keys out might not be a present-day option. That's all for now. When we continue, we'll cover the Packers' continuing slide on one of Bart Starr's lowest points in his entire playing career. See you next time.